and we're delighted to introduce Professor Sennett, who's here to give the first of a new series of annual public lectures raised to the School of Architecture, Planning and Landscape. Richard Sennett is Centennial Professor of Sociology at the NYC, University Professor of the Humanities at New York University. He is the founding director of the New York Institute for the Humanities. His work explores how individuals and groups make social and cultural sense of material facts about cities in which they live and about the labour they do. He focuses on how people can become competent interpreters of their own experience.
Then I'll turn mine off.
So he focuses on how people can become competent interpreters of their own experience despite the obstacles society may put in their way. His research entails ethnography, history, and social theory. As a social analyst, he continues the pragmatist tradition begun by William James and John Dewey. Now, he's pursued these concerns through a series of highly influential books, which include The Fall of Public Man in 1977, The Conscience of the Eye, subtitled The Design of Social Life in Cities from 1980, Flesh and Stone, 1992, and more recently, The Culture of the New Capitalism, 2006, The Craftsman, 2008, and most recently, Together, The Rituals, Pleasures and Politics of Cooperation. Professor Sennett's scholarship has been highly significant across a whole range of disciplines, and that's reflected in the interest shown in this event and by your presence here tonight. Now, it's a pleasure and privilege then to invite him to talk, what I was anticipating was saying it's a pleasure to invite him to talk on the architecture of cooperation, but I think he's going to talk about something else. We'll expand upon the due course.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes. Yeah? Okay. Well, I'm really glad to come up to inaugurate this lecture series. I do want to talk about something that I'm writing about now, which is even more architectural, which is about edges. And I'm interested in edges in the city and edges in the self, about a relation between the subjective and objective experience of an edge condition. I'm going to sit, may I just intrude one personal thing on this, for which I'll need your help. I had a stroke a couple of months ago, and I may not always be as clear as I'd like to be. So if you don't understand something, just wave your hand and I'll repeat what I had written. It's a very strange thing about this. I had very mild stroke, but what's clear to me sometimes is not clear to other people, and vice versa, where I think I've been very slurry. Something is very clear to someone else. So anyhow, let me know if you don't get some part of this talk. Like many others, I've been thinking about how to give new life to the left. Simply stirring up revolutionary zeal doesn't seem to get very far, since everyone, right and center as well as left, is full of rage about something. More thanks to the Occupy movements, is a question about where struggle should occur, particularly in cities. We want to know where are the new political spaces. But I've had a particular concern about renewing the politics on the left. It's social psychology. What kind of inner strength allows people to resist and to combine with others? Is it simply a shared experience of oppression, or is it more subtle psychologically? Now, I'm going to burden you with all these questions, and of course I've got no certain answers. But I have a point of view that certain spaces in the city for politics intersect with certain psychological strengths. Put simply, that where we are and what we feel combine. This potent combination occurs, I will argue, as an edge condition in the city and within the self. Now, an old instance of this may make clear what I mean. You know that Sephardic Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492. Many wound up in the ghetto of Venice, an isolated space at the edge of the city, a space in which, however, the exiled Jews produced a distinctive set of religious practices and placed a new value on being Jewish. New experience as exiles literally on the edges of a strange city brought out a kind of psychological self-awareness and a certain flexibility the Jews had not shown before inside Spain. This is something I've written about a lot in my book Flesh and Stone. It's an amazing story about how these people living in a marginal space become stronger rather than weaker. More generally, we could say that an edge, as in the borders between two different ethnic communities in the city, is a zone of ambiguity, of liminality, that I don't particularly like and I find difficult to pronounce, but let's use it. In learning how to deal with the other across this uncertain, often tense divide, each group can become more socially skilled. And the same is true psychologically. It's by learning how to manage the uncertain borders of the self in relation to other selves that individuals develop what psychoanalysis calls ego strength, which is the confidence to live in a complex world in an ambiguous and often incomplete state. In society, such strength, I think, can be put to political use. It can help people resist injustice. So let me try and make all of this now more concrete. Let's start with edges in time. A famous image from Freud's writings makes us think about the separations, the edges of experience over the course of time. He compared the human psyche to the city of Rome. Modern Romans tread over past scenes of love and lust, literally buried beneath their feet in ages past. Though a man or a woman walking the streets today is unconscious of these hidden layers, the rubble built up by past habitation is the solid substance which supports his or her feet. The human psyche is, Freud argued, just similarly layered. Usually we are unaware of the depths below the surface, but this psychic rubble is the ground, this unconsciousness is the ground of our waking life. It's such a seductive image or analogy, but in one way it's so misleading. When people make the transition from one kind of experience to another in time, they often become aware of a dissonance or a difference. They become more hyperconscious. This happens to children in the transition from dealing with parents, for instance, to dealing with teachers. As adults, we feel the transit from an initial sexual encounter to a long-term love. The passage can excite or confuse us, but the important thing is that at the moment of transition itself, we do not bury, forget, and go on. Rather, we have at that moment a heightened awareness of the difference between past and present. This is a kind of transitional consciousness, and contrary to Freud, these particular moments are not psychic rubble. Rather, they stay with us, helping us to distinguish one kind of experience from another, and so shaping behavior. R.W. Winnicott first alerted psychologists to the importance of transitional moments, which which establish the borders between experience for children. And some recent studies of long-term memory complement this, pointing to the ability of elderly people to recall sharply moments of shift in their lives, even as the content within each time layer has become fuzzy. Think in a related vein of the stimulations of shift, the provocations of transition, the dissonances of liminality, is that word again, which occur in the poetry of Rambo or Rilke. The marker of value in all these cases is a rupture, a tear in experience, rather than a smooth shift of scene, which creates the edges of experience. So this then is something we want to keep in mind as a fundamental condition of what we mean by a psychological edge. It's a rupture. But as we move from Freud's image from this time edge of the unconscious, buried psychic rubble, to a more conscious idea, we also need to sharpen our spatial thinking about the edge. Remember I said I'm going to put these two together, and so now I get on more, for me at least, familiar terrain. In nature, physical edges come in two sorts. They appear either as borders or as boundaries. At the cellular level, the differences between a cell membrane, which is a border, and a cell wall, which establishes a boundary. The cell wall holds in as much material as possible within its confines. The cell membrane is more open to exchange with the outside, but not entirely so. A membrane is both porous and resistant, letting in nutrients, for instance, expelling used material, yet trying to retain inside what is valuable to its ongoing functioning. Interesting, or at least interesting to me, the edge of a cell can switch between functioning as a wall or as a membrane, between a border or a boundary. And the pregnant fact here, though, is, I think, the membrane condition. Rather than simply an open door to the environment, this kind of edge is more complex in being both porous and resistant. It's an ambiguous condition which has great consequences for more complex structures. Let me just jump ahead for a second. When I teach planning and urban design students about edges and how to get rid of this boundary conditions, which were surrounded, as I'll say later, everywhere in the city, their immediate notion is to destroy all barriers, to have no markers, that an open, empty space is the freest space you can make. But that's not the condition in our somatic world of what openness means. It's a more complex condition than simply an absence of impediment, an absence of resistance. It has this peculiar combination of porosity and resistance, of something you can retain, which you know is yours, your community, and yet an outside to which you can get into, which is porous. Let's make a big leap from cells to natural ecologies. Now we find that the difference between borders and boundaries takes on a new character. Now the boundary edge, as in the marking, it becomes as in the marking of territorial edges by tigers or bears. These become low interactions between species. Keep up. Whereas border edges, as in the meeting of water and land along the seashore, are high activity zones, places where creatures feed off other species and where the pace of evolution speeds up. So the contrast between cell wall and cell membrane becomes, in natural ecologies, the difference between less intense and more intense life. Between, if you think of your J. Jacobs, between the life and death places. So it has this character of intensity. So now let's make a further link. The ecological difference marks human communities too. Gated housing estates, isolated business campuses, shopping malls are places surrounded by boundaries, and these are in one way low-intensity habitats because they are not much stimulated by difference. They have a single function, and that's that. As I say, left-wing planners like myself are tempted simply to open them up, letting in all sorts of inappropriate activities and people to seep in. But as I just explained to you, it's not quite so simple. The model of the cell membrane cautions against taking sheer openness and lack of barriers as the corrective. There must be some combination of porosity and resistance. As in a mixed street of shops, flats, and small businesses, each distinct in purpose and activity within, yet contributing to the mix of people out on the street. We say such compound places are full of life, and that's more than a metaphor. It reflects, literally, a certain kind of edge. Now, significant edges, which are membrane-like, do not just happen, nor are they easy to deal with. These edges require interpreting and a certain skill in navigating. If you think of a medieval urban wall like that surrounding Avignon, for instance, you might imagine from its stony bulk that this wall is an impenetrable barrier, a boundary of the most life-ending sort. You see it as inert. You don't think much about inhabiting it. In fact, Avignon's medieval walls, which were far from the center, were also places Jews, prostitutes, and other outcasts tended to congregate. Places as well where the unregulated black economy of the city flourished. These inhabitants needed to know how to navigate the forbidden, complicated, often dangerous edges. More precisely, the inhabitants needed to become skilled in dealing with ambiguities of policing, black market, trading, and squatting at the wall. For instance, you needed to know if you were dealing in black market or gray market goods, just whom to bribe, where you would set up your stall, where you could run away when the police came, and so on. And knowing how to make these complicated edge spaces work made the solid wall function like a permeable membrane. Okay? Now, like the anthropologist James Scott, I believe this kind of seemingly apolitical experience in fact underlies the real experience of resistance and politics in a wide variety of settings. For him, that is for James Scott, managing hostile everyday realities is primarily something we do linguistically. For me, it is also something we do spatially. Poor people can learn to manipulate the physical environment when they have no chance of changing reigning discourses. But there's a problem here. I believe that's true that the politics of dealing with space is something people do when they can't deal with verbal forms of domination. But there's a problem. The threat of boundaries is this next section. A big social fact today disarms people in using the environment, so competently. It's the dominance of boundaries over borders. Let's recur to Rome, not Freud's time-layered Rome, but the Rome of today. It's now a city in which boundaries have replaced borders. If you walk in an old area like the Piazza del Popolo, you see gentrification signs of it everywhere on the side streets. The poor being pushed out as the bourgeois bohemians, like us, move in. The big shopping streets are full of international chain stores. Offices and workshops are moving out to faceless buildings on the periphery. Tourists dominate the streets. Most modern cities are becoming like this, outside Europe as well as within it. Spatial segregation means that sites for mixture, for the experience of porosity, for the porosity between different peoples and different functions are fading. Modern Beijing has been planned with a strict regime of spatial separation, as has modern Mumbai. These are two cities in which my research group has been in London, has been working with local community groups who are absolutely powerless against the desire for a boundary-like segregation, where once there were much more mixed conditions in the city. And I think it's true generally that in the globalization of cities, the boundary is replacing the border, and that cities are ever less internally porous. This political consequence of this replacement is that spaces where people can practice politics are diminishing. The unhappiness of the poor, of the immigrant, is rendered invisible. Invisible to privileged segments of the population. Calculative discourses, zoning, smart city planning, and the like, push away unsettling forms of encounter. But the positive, mutually bonding aspect to practicing politics also disappears. The spaces poor people occupy become inward turning, and inward turning spaces tend to shrink into smaller and smaller zones. People losing a sense of connection to comrades or fellow sufferers who are physically distant. As for resistance, so for cooperation then. The places where people who might differ could cooperate in seemingly trivial activities like managing an allotment or a playground are shrinking as they become subject to ever more formalized rules of the boundary. Which is practically why this matters. We are globally, I think, in a new regime of segregation. The globalization of segregation. I will talk then next about two models of political space. The question then is where to resist boundary dominance. And we've got two models of where. One is the occupy model, which is to draw people out of their isolation, draw them into a central square or near a central, highly visible place like St. Paul's here in UK and in London. The spatial ideal here is to create a vital center for political activity to counter the deadening effects of boundary enclosure. The other model of political space is to counter a bad edge with a good edge. Against the boundary, assert the virtues of the border. For instance, Mumbai's Dharavi slum. The streets of Dharavi function today like Avignon's walls. They're spaces of amorphous, informal activity, both porous and resistant to the outside. And by the way, if you haven't been there, what you have to imagine is a so-called slum which has 3 million people in the midst of a city of 30 million. So it's enormous. It's not like a little section of Mumbai. It's this vast smear of mostly informal, amorphous settlement, which if you are rich or a member of the IMF or in any other way outside of Dharavi, you look at as an eyesore. It's horrible. What the people within have done in terms of resistance is that they've erected barriers to automobile traffic to keep the streets free for all this pedestrian commerce and mixture of living and working space. There, planner after planner is said about Dharavi. If only we could get a 4-lane roadway in there, it would be so much more efficient, which the people in Dharavi are sensible enough to know that for every added lane width, four lanes wide means maybe 100,000 people displaced. 6 lanes wide would mean 500,000 people displaced. So they are absolutely, they're the most ferocious pedestrian politics that you can imagine, because they've connected this to a way of resisting the incursions of a bourgeois outside. But on the porosity side, they have taken in the surrounding elements in this huge smush of people, economic activity, and for India, even different religions. It's very porous. The relations between Muslims and Hindus are tense, but they work on a day-to-day basis in a way that an Indian village would not be, or a village in which Muslims and Hindus are rigidly segregated for each other. Membranes of community like Dharavi, but if on a smaller scale, can be found in slums from Buenos Aires to Rangoon. And this is the membrane condition, is a condition that many poor people have made work for themselves physically, even though ideologically they're squashed down. Now, these are two models of political space. The center, that is, the occupied idea, or the membrane, that is, the Dharavi idea. They serve different purposes. The center is a short-term space. It's the space of protest and demonstration. It's the space of making visible, of visibility. The border is a long-term space, in which a single community becomes more complex, has less and less a defined, particularly defined identity, and the communities seep into one another. And this process may be invisible at first sight. I'm sorry to interrupt my own text, but I remember in Dharavi going with some officials from the World Bank, which has been trying to destroy parts of Dharavi for nearly 20 years. And I said, look at how complex this community is. I said, what do you mean? I mean, there's just these cows wandering around. There are people selling things and sleeping next to what they're selling. And we made them stay there for 3 hours. These were very important World Bank officials. And after 3 hours, they got it. That there was so much that was happening on the street, but that simply, scopically, you'd never see it. You had to see changes in time geography. You had to see the merest greeting between a Muslim, a woman in a niqab, and a woman in a sari. Just the smallest movement of recognition. All of that is what happens in this other kind of political space. And it's something that is not the politics of visibility, or at least legibility at first sight. Another way to think about these two different models of political space that the Occupy sort of space is about politics as an event. The border is about politics as a process. For community organizers, I want to argue, the Occupy model is not the space we should be aiming at. We want to activate more sustained goals in the border. That is, because it's been so dramatic and it's going to go on again next year, it's going to take on new life. This looks like the new political space for left-wing politics. And my argument to you is it isn't. It is space for a certain kind of event politics. But if we want to sustain politics of resistance, we should focus on the border rather than on this central and visible space. Now, it's just because the border is an ambiguous space that it's here I'd like to bring psychology back into the picture. Certainly, psychology provides no direct strategy for breaking the rule of the boundary. Rather, it gives some insight into the kinds of persons we need to become to practice what could be called membrane politics. The membrane border is an important psychological concept. It locates where we develop inner strength, which writers like Heinz Hartmann or Erickson long ago called ego strength. And in a way, ego strength is a seemingly self-evident phenomenon. Of course, a strong self should be both porous and resistant. The individual should be able to retain what is valuable to him or herself while being open to new influences. But the bite in Erickson's writings, however, was to emphasize just those disruptive, time-edged experiences that I alluded to before. Unlike his contemporary Abraham Maslow, he conceived of human development as a succession of crises, of ruptures, a new love affair, a new job, promising pain, potential danger, and certainly rupture as equal measure as pleasure. These crises must be interpreted, and usually they are incompletely resolved. Put another way, and here's where this bears on our spatial and political concerns. Put another way, there is no one ideal equilibrium between porosity and resistance in the self, in the membrane of the self. There is no final right balance. There's only a continual effort to pay attention and to respond to these differences in time. And this insight is really important to us politically for two reasons. First, it tells us that strength is a matter of exploiting ambiguities rather than banishing them. The ego strength of someone resisting injustice lies in focusing on what is unresolved or incomplete, exploiting that condition, finding, as it were, the cracks in the wall of the dominant power. For instance, in dealing, I'll give you an American example of this, which occurred in the last election. I have a friend, Elizabeth Warren, who became the senator in Massachusetts, hotly contested election in which the far right poured millions of dollars. Her opponent, a little twerp, who was the a little twerp, had a very clear statement of what he would do and wouldn't do. And her glory was to say, it's not so simple. I can't, against this Scott Brown, I can't give you the negative of that. But I can show you what's ambiguous in what he's talking about. And those ambiguities shouldn't be papered over. Initially, people thought that Elizabeth was committing suicide by making this argument that it's ambiguous. But the more she exploited him, the more that he put forward the notion that he had everything clear, the less credible he seemed. It's a little like Osborne here, you know? It's absolutely clear, right? And because it's so clear, its credibility is low. So, sorry, I had to come by citizenship, yeah, but you know what I mean. So there's something about having the strength to embrace ambiguity, which is a deeply political power. And second, this concept of ego strength cautions us against thinking of some fixed political property called what I believe or my principles. The self does not flourish by a rigid image. It cannot move forward and develop by hewing to fixed ideals of itself. And neither, I think, can politics. And we can talk about it. So, it would lead us away from most political, if you take on board this, it would lead us away from most forms of political practice today. Haunting though Freud's Rome is, this is why we do better to compare the psyche to a city directly in terms of horizontal space. We'd want to imagine the psychic center as a place of drives and instincts, to liken the center and the periphery of a city to mental awareness of inner desire and outer necessity, and to see the urban psychic membrane as the kind of edge where the activity of negotiating between inside and outside occurs, an ambiguous negotiation with no guarantee of agreement and no quality of certainty. What there would be is the strength to deal with, recognize, name ambiguity. The membrane, and I think of that as a horizontal space. The membrane, that is, may be the most important space of the psyche. Here is the zone where interpreting uncertainty and ambiguity becomes more important than confessing feelings within. Its most challenging labor will be dealing with stimulation and experience it cannot quite name or initially comprehend. Now, let me just add as a coda to all of this to a university to follow. The human sciences have imagined strength and weakness in ways which ill serves our understanding of how people deal with justice, either in space or in the self. This deformation professionnelle appears in the metaphorical distinction between hard and soft. Hard deals with facts and structures. Soft bathes in feelings and impressions. 20th century social science privileged the hard over the soft. It's more compelling, more powerful, more political, with the result that the scope of human strength became narrowed. We could never truly understand ego strength, or politically, the decision to seek alternatives to those hard facts in the ground, if we hewed to this way of thinking, that is, that hard was the realm of action. In terms of human cognition, the difference between hard and soft turns, and I should say that it's clear to you that hard is the realm of the boundary, and soft is the realm of border. In terms of human cognition, the difference between hard and soft knowledge turns on whether we emphasize calculation or interpretation. The first is a matter of reckoning data, the second is a matter of judging value. All human beings use both, as when in an argument we assemble information and then debate its merits. When pulled apart, each of these two forms of understanding regresses. Untamed calculation can lead to closure, that is, the desire for certainty and finality. And closure sets up those boundary conditions within the mind. Interpretation can become an endless stream of impressions, subjectivity, and views, if open, still unanchored. Mental risk is of a purely porous state to which the interpreting subject offers no resistance, that is, no discipline. A personal confidence is required, an ego strength, in one's ability to dwell in ambiguity in order to conduct this dialogue between calculation and interpretation. And in this regard, we might imagine ego strength to be like a chemical reaction in which solids emerge from the swirling liquid mass of ingredients. Forgive my metaphor. Sociologists have long held that differentiation results from the interaction. This truism applies to markets, for instance, in which traders gradually carve out distinct niches for themselves. It applies equally to long-established cities, whose streets have gradually taken on each a distinctive character. And it applies to the self, producing the paradox that there can be an correlation between ambiguity and concreteness. That's my most important sentence to you. That there's a correlation between ambiguity and concreteness. If something is obscure, it requires more particular attention. It requires analysis and specific interpretation. And there's a whole theory behind this, theory of what's called cognitive dissonance, which is when things don't fit together or are ambiguous. We have what's called focal attention. So the more cognitive dissonance we have, the more we're focused on that thing. And you see it with pigeons, for instance, when they're subject to contrary rules about where they get feeding, whatever pigeons want. Their eye movements are much more focused than when they just learn the habit of knowing if I go to this space in the environment, I'll find some seed. And it's true of human beings as well. It's not clarity that makes us cognitively attentive. It's ambiguity. And it makes us attend the ambiguities to the particularities of what's in the environment. Now, I'd say that the social science contrast between hard and soft is a practical political consequence. Oppressors deploy hardness, that is, closed discourses, final and certain in their terms, bounded to shore up regimes. In the realm of capitalist labor, for instance, the ruler will employ the certainties of the market to foreclose and fix obedience from hapless workers, like your unnameable chancellor. Asking questions, introducing poisonous doubts, unsettling assumptions, are ways of resisting through interpretation this fixed inert regime of power, like my friend in Massachusetts. We need supposedly soft, interpretive kinds of thinking to challenge unjust social conditions. But the address must not become pure negation, an unending hermeneutic of suspicion. Nothing good is possible is the same as saying, I submit. I'm arguing, that is, for a kind of political discourse which comes out of a psychological conviction that we can manage ambiguity, that the possibilities reside in all these uncertainties, smudges, and edges of an adult experience, adulthood being a boundary membrane. So let me conclude as follows. I hope I can. A famous phrase of Seneca runs, "I need to be with others in order to know myself." For this to happen requires a certain kind of mental and physical space, an edge which functions itself as membrane, porous yet resistance, so that the self exchanges with others but does not meld away in an oceanic way with them. Experience of a border is not likely to stimulate this. It's a dead edge. If you insist you are entirely different from me, there is no possibility of exchange. But also, if you think your calculations about our relations are absolute and certain, then nothing much is also going to happen between us. Whereas if our relations are more membrane-like and we dwell in some mutual uncertainty and confusion, I am more likely to try and understand myself with you, connected and distant, and cooperate with you. Politically, for the same reason, therefore, we should want to transform the boundaries of regime into borders. When I marched and camped during the Occupy movements last year, I had the uncomfortable sensation that we should not be seeking a protected territory for ourselves, a territory which separated us from the ordinary life of London. Better to occupy space sporadically and unpredictably in the city, to conduct a more nomad politics. And I don't know if you're aware of that. I mean, the Occupying movement, it sought for refuge, for sanctuary in the city, which is in New York and in Germany as well as in Britain. And I had the feeling that that was just the wrong way to go about this. We should have been with people looking at us. Instead of marching coherently, we should have been going into the crowd and talking about what we felt. Those experiences in London, we mostly had with the very kind people in the Pret-a-Manger who gave us sandwiches. And I would say that whenever we went in to use the loo or get sandwiches, those were the really political moments of Occupy. They weren't the chanting, the sloganeering. I think it's better, as I say, to occupy space sporadically and unpredictably in the city, to conduct this more nomad politics. This ambiguous use of space would have made Occupy a membrane politics, if you like, prompting both public and protesters to deal with one another in ordinary but anarchic circumstances. That kind of address to everyday uncertainty has equally to be the skill set of the community organizer, who does not want just one-day strikes or one-month occupations, but some kind of durable political activity, which means in a complex city like London or New York, addressing the unresolvable mixture of its population. I conclude simply by saying that both socially and psychologically, we need to strengthen borders and weaken boundaries. We need to do so for the sake of developing a more engaged social order and for the sake of our own emotional development. So that's what I have to say for you. I'd love to get comments from you, whatever your reactions. Do you mind if I sit? Well, actually, I can stand on the edge of this.
Can we open the floor for questions? There's this question over here.
Can you shout?
Yes, in order to strengthen community identity, you've emphasized the border of the edge. But is it not also necessary center, because if people are to identify, that people must associate in the General Assembly to begin to shape their community.
I'm really sorry you asked me this question because it's such a good question. It requires a really long answer. And just shut me up tonight. It's a very good question. First of all, is that what should left-wing politics be about strengthening identity? Okay. Or should it be making people feel that they have more than one identity? You know, it's a big issue. My own view is that making people see themselves as just one identity. For instance, being Hamas rather than being Hamas and also the doctor and something else, is not good for the left. I think that the game of, and this is Michel Foucault's old idea, that the game of the oppressor is always to say, tell me who you are, tell me about you, define yourself, then I can say what I give to your needs, what I don't, and so on. So I think there's a real issue about whether we want to strengthen communal identity, or whether we want to have something which is a more mixed thing, where people have many senses of their own possible identity. And the second thing, endless issue, is a point I'll give to you from my planning practice. In the 1980s, this is a very recherché example I'm going to give to you, but I'll try to make it clear. In the 1980s, I was part of a group which was building a market for Hispanics who lived in New York City. And we could have located it two places. One was in the middle of Spanish Harlem, which is around 115th Street and 7th Avenue. And the other was we could have put this market, which was sponsored by the city and had all sorts of wonderful things, chorizos, fantastic plantains, all sorts of that good Spanish food that you want, Hispanic food that you want. We could have put it at 96th Street, which is currently the boundary and between one of the richest parts in the places in the world, which is the Upper East Side, and one of the poorest places, which is Harlem, both Black Harlem and Spanish Harlem. And we made a terrible error. I realize we chose to locate a social resource in the center of the community, which meant that only people who were Hispanic members of that community used the Hispanic market. If we put it on 96th Street, on this border, if we tried to make that market an instrument of making a border, it would have meant at least not that the lady in a fur coat going out to buy milk would speak to people who were like her Spanish maids in the assembly line, but that the two of them physically would be in the same place for just something very, very simple. That there would have been a kind of integration which was unideological, nameless, but that happened where will didn't come into it, where they were simply together. And we fluffed it because we were so into this notion that community resources go in the centers of places. What I now do as a planner, and what I try to get my students to do, is figure out when you have an external resource like a school, a hospital, clinic, a market if you have some control over it, some public good, where can you put it where it intersects between two communities rather than serves one community? Now that's got a downside to it, which is geographic, which is, maybe farther from people to go to school. But you don't do what you do with schooling, for instance, which is what you have in this country, postcode lottery sort of thing. You try and use public resources so that they're always sited between communities. So, and that's what we're doing in Johannesburg now. So, I think I disagree with the thrust of your question, both analytically, but I think you raise really a profound question for urban planners and designers, which is, when we make something, where do we make it? We don't make it to strengthen community. We put it, library, school, health clinic, we put it someplace which fudges, in my view, the lines between communities. It's many things to talk about. So, other comments? Yeah. Shout, because it's a very big room.
I'm really interested in your notion of ambiguous states. I'm not an architect, I'm a fine artist, but I really like the idea that there is a solution to things in a way.
Yeah, you would.
And I wondered what you thought about what was happening in the Middle East with regard to the Arab Spring, because so in the West we kind of have this idea, well, you've got the masses fighting against their oppressors, and so in a way they're looking for a solution, and yet at the same time there's this huge ambiguity happening apparently in all the countries that, we're looking for a solution, and I was just wondering what your thoughts are.
Well, I'm no expert on that, but I know there are a couple of people in my shop who have been studying Tahrir Square in particular, how it works. And what they've argued is the good thing about Tahrir Square, which is an Occupy-like space, is that it's mixed lots and lots of people together who normally don't get mixed together. So, and that's true with Morsi as well as it was with, what's his name? It's gone on my mind. Yeah, Mubarak. That the advantage of that kind of space is that you've got a lot of people who are different coming together. And Mubarak, of course, is somebody who believes in the politics of solidarity. And that's what people are resisting. I wonder if it must be different in Syria, where you've got, because it's a violent regime, that if somebody's firing tear gas at you, it's one thing, but if somebody's firing live bullets at you, the virtues of ambiguity are maybe less. You know what I mean? I don't know how that will play out. But I think that what we know as artists, that being able to live with something that's unresolved is also something we know politically. Or we should know politically. That's what I think about. There's a difference between this kind of membrane-like idea and the notion of sort of mess, tout court, because it has a focus. That is, you know where you can resist the other and where you can exchange with them. It's not pure process. we're talking about. Neither is it urbanistically, nor is it psychologically. And maybe one of the problems politically is that it looks like there's no shape to this phenomenon when you get into something like the Middle East. But I would say for us, our dominant problem is too much order. You know, that's not what we learn from these conflicts. We're in a different space, literally. We're in a regime where the boundary, the segregating boundary, is the overwhelming political fact of our time. You know? So to me, it's like, you know, fears about crime. They always mask something else. In cities, they mask racism, you know, dislike of poor people, and so on. So you always have this overreaction. And I wonder if people who say, well, this is anarchic, you know, we need order and so on. Maybe it's a hidden way to get at that, to express something else, which is desire to dominate. Yeah.
You mentioned you've done a bit of research in the slums in India, and obviously that's an example of people taking housing into their own hands when the government can't provide for them. And I was wondering, just in light of all the kind of austerity politics that are happening all around the kind of Western world at the moment, whether, and obviously the state's probably going to play less and less of a role in people's lives.
What is going to play less of a
Less
role?
of a role.
What is going to?
The state.
The state.
Yeah. Perhaps.
Perhaps.
In light of the fact that there's so many cuts, and in terms of less housing being built up for
Well,
people. And I was just wondering whether whether there's something to be taken from these communities, informal settlements in places like India, where they've actually taken housing into their own hands, whether there's something to be taken from that into a UK context.
That's a really interesting idea. I don't think it's right. Because what you've got in the UK and the US is less and less money, but more and more control. You know exactly what I mean. If there was really decentralization in this country, you wouldn't have a chancellor's budget, which lays out what you can spend money on. You would just say, here's 10 billion, you're London, use the money as you see fit. But it's the same thing in the US, that these people who are not cutting power, they're just cutting, they're cutting the funds for people to execute rules which are not given away. And it's one of the great, it's one of the great frauds of this in America, the Tea Party movement, that they're really Thatcherite. More control, less resources. And if I thought that the state were actually diminishing, I'd be the first to be far right. But you know what I mean. But the problem is it's a fraud. I think Obama is just sort of is accepted that if he's going to cut funds, because the U.S. Is cutting funds as well, that he's got to give up some federal powers. But here, that's not the case.
But what in terms of like cutting services, for example, for people?
Right, but I'm saying, if somebody, let me put it this way, if somebody cut, say, child binding services for you and said, okay, there's no longer a national regime about checking out child minders. You have to use your own judgment for it. Or in universities, we cut the amount of money we're going to give you, but you decide what's good quality. You're the faculty. You decide what's good quality and what isn't. But as those of you who are involved in the REF here will know, we're subject to this even though we're getting less and less money, we're subject to more and more regulation. So it's a risk. You know, if you say to somebody, I'm going to give you less money, you take care of it yourself. You might make mistakes. You might get pedophile childminders. But the responsibility for that would be on the people who are actually doing the work. So that's my problem with this.
Question, how would you revolutionize the property industry to allow scope for your ideas? I'm thinking about
Look like me.
the biggest redevelopment scheme in England, I think, is the south bank of the Thames between Battersea Power Station and
Yeah.
Waterloo Station. Has very hard edges, the river on one side and a 4-track railway in the other. The US Embassy with all sorts of security needs in the middle. And then the way finance has segmented the rest of the line between, you know, money has come forward for sites of different density, different social needs, parking,
Yeah.
leisure, and so on and so on. How can you practically overthrow that financial hegemony? I mean, we have concepts of mixed use running through British architecture. Sorry.
I mean, there are lots of ways you can contest it, but and I think it depends on the site about which of those tools you use. You know, there isn't one. I haven't found that there's one kind of principle or one kind of set of strategies that one model that fits all. That's a model of, that's a site which is disused, it's got an enormous structure in place which has to be colonized. Some people have argued that the renovation part of it, the capitalist big money bucks part of it, should only be inside, and that the outside should be left to much slower, smaller forms of development, which would be in that case a reasonable way to proceed. That is, that the people who can renovate this disused structure can make money out of it, but that the surrounding, it's not, in other words, it's not conceived as a district. But, you know, that's something particular to that. Let's take one or two more questions. I need a daily dose of whiskey.
Have got some water.
It's very good for stroke.
So, from music, I'm very conscious myself, and amongst other people online communities, that it's becoming increasingly easy to stick to reading what you like and what you know.
Right.
And so, do we need porous mechanisms online as well?
You've answered your own question. We do. I mean, isn't that, this is something that the reality, I don't know much about this, but except what you know, I've made the same observation you've made. The web, which should open us up to an enormous number of different things, is pretty much being used to tailor. I mean, Google is constantly doing profiles to know exactly what we like from our prior sorts of things. I mean, if there were a political movement, maybe it would be that everybody Googled something they were completely uninterested in, you know, and throw the computers in complete neurotic. But I think the serious point you're raising, which is that in principle, the web could be a giant set of borders, and it's becoming more and more a set of boundaries. And that has to do with consumerism, probably, you know? Maybe that's too simple. So let's ask one more question.
You talked a lot about Occupy, and I was wondering how you feel that international
Well, to be fair about this, I don't know how it was here, but the first month of Occupy in the States, and the same was true in Germany, nobody paid, it was just this bunch of crazies, nobody paid any attention to them, you know. And it wasn't a political movement until the police began to try and, you know, take people to close down the sites. And so it was an amazing event in that way. That this little group, there were 700 people in the Occupy movement in the US, and it had more media attention than, you know, huge demos, and, you know, people began to think, yeah, I'm part of the 99% too, you know. Even people who were in the 1% said, not really. You have to be at the 0.1%. So, I mean, it was a kind of consciousness-raising exercise. And I think the things that they'll be doing next year, which are occupy sites in unlikely spaces, that's the plan, in Germany and in the States at least, is good, so that you'll have a camp maybe in a parking lot, something like that, to make it closer to local community. I think that's good. I just think it's, in a way, it's a kind of victim of its own success, that it becomes the model for political space. And it's too driven by the visible event, by what Guy Debord called, it is the society of the spectacle. You know? That's what he had in mind. And I think what we need to do in cities is develop a kind of non-spectacle politics that's about a different kind of issue. But don't put them down. You know, they did something really remarkable, which the Labour Party, for instance, millions of people in the Labour Party, or not millions, but lots of people in the Labour Party go on about the evils of capitalism, snore, you know? Whereas these guys on the steps of St. Paul's really made it dramatic in a way that a political party didn't. And the other good thing I would say about them is that they resisted in the States any attempt for, once the machinery of media had set in, to let organized political parties come into the encampments. I don't know if that was true here to the same degree, but in Wall Street, every left-wing Democratic politician wanted to have a photo op at Zuccotti Park. And when they announced I'm Congressman so-and-so, people would say, this is not for you. Now, that's a really good lesson, you know? It's that this is something that doesn't have to do with being absorbed into the political machine, you know? So, you know, I know there are lots of things you could say about, you know, this. It is becoming more bureaucratic. You know, it's got a leadership structure, which it didn't have initially. But still, it really did. It's the only left-wing politics really engaged the public. You know, so I wouldn't put it down. Can I make one final comment about this? If you're ever disposed to read a book of President Obama's, which people don't read very much, about him, which people don't read very much, it's a book about him by Joe Marinos, about Obama's political, as a community organizer. And a lot of what I've been telling you is stuff that he actually practiced as a political community organizer and then stopped practicing when he became president. I mean, things about cultivating ambiguity, about the location of resources between communities, so on. He's a very complex character, and of course he's much more powerful as a president than he ever have been as a political organizer, but it's a kind of schizophrenia in him. And he did really quite a lot race relations in Chicago because he had this notion that there wouldn't be any more black politics in Chicago. There wouldn't be black wars. You know, that this was a boundary condition and that it had to end. So I can't remember what this Marinus book, its title is, but it's got about 200 pages on Obama as a community organizer. You could see there somebody sort of putting into practice some of the ideas I mentioned to you tonight, and then stop putting them into practice when you got a different job. So thank you very much. I look forward to knowing about more of your series and coming back to Newcastle, which I do occasionally.
Great. Well, thank you.